One of the most dangerous parts of emotional abuse is that it changes slowly enough for people to adapt to it while it is happening. What once would have felt shocking eventually becomes routine. Being monitored, accused, controlled, humiliated, or hurt starts blending into everyday life until survival itself begins shaping a person's identity. That process rarely happens all at once. Most abusive relationships do not begin with obvious violence. They begin with emotional dependency, manipulation, guilt, isolation, and gradual control. By the time physical violence escalates openly, the victim is often already emotionally trapped in ways outsiders cannot easily see. And that is where Bonnie's story continues. In part 1, Bonnie described growing up around instability, violence, addiction, and emotional insecurity before entering a relationship with a 23-year-old man, while she was still a vulnerable teenager. What began as attention and affection slowly became manipulation, coercion, isolation, and assault. By the end of the first chapter, she had already become emotionally trapped long before she fully understood the danger she was living inside. Part 2 is where the abuse becomes more openly physical, psychologically controlling, and emotionally consuming. Welcome to No One Is Normal, the podcast where real stories remind us that none of us are alone. You can also visit the website www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co for resources, updates, and future podcast episodes. I am Brad H. Hill, and each week we talk about the messy, the complicated, and the deeply human moments that shape us and remain in our memories. I am not here to tell anyone how to live. I am here to offer the stories, the insights that made me realize that no one is normal, including me, because healing starts when self-honesty begins. By the time Bonnie moved in with him at 17 years old, the emotional foundation of the relationship had already shifted. The affection that once made her feel wanted had become possessiveness. The attention that once felt comforting had become surveillance. And the man who convinced her he loved her was beginning to show her who he really was behind closed doors. Bonnie says the first time he physically hit her happened within the first week or two after moving in together. They had gone out drinking the night before, and the next morning, while she was getting ready for school, he accused her of looking at another man at the party. She denied it repeatedly, but he would not let it go. The accusations escalated quickly into insults, before he suddenly shoved her so hard that she flew backward down the hallway and crashed to the floor while her school books scattered everywhere. She describes immediately feeling the same fear she had experienced during the assault earlier in the relationship. In that moment, something inside her recognized she had made a devastating mistake moving in with him. She grabbed her things and tried leaving, but he physically stopped her, shoved her against the wall, and reminded her of something he knew she feared deeply. "You are not going anywhere. Where are you going to go? Your mother doesn't even want you back." That statement reveals something important about abuse dynamics. Emotional isolation had already become part of the control. He understood that Bonnie already felt disconnected from safety and support outside the relationship, and he weaponized that fear against her almost immediately. Looking back now, Bonnie says she wishes she had left that day, but hindsight creates clarity. People rarely have, while they are emotionally trapped inside fear, manipulation, dependency, and confusion in real time. As the relationship progressed, Bonnie describes the abuse becoming psychologically disorienting because it was not constant in the way people often imagine. There were periods where he acted charming, apologetic, affectionate, or emotionally supportive. Then suddenly the cruelty would return again. That emotional inconsistency is one of the reasons abusive relationships become so confusing psychologically. The victim often clings to the calmer version of the person while trying to avoid triggering the violent one. Over time, they begin managing their own behavior around the hope of preventing conflict. Bonnie describes him repeatedly telling her that the abuse only happened because she made him angry. Eventually, she began believing that narrative herself. That is part of what gaslighting does. It slowly shifts responsibility away from the abuser and onto the victim until the victim begins questioning their own judgment, memory, reactions, and worth. Over time, the person being abused often becomes hyper-focused on avoiding conflict rather than questioning whether the behavior itself is acceptable. During this period, Bonnie says he introduced her to cocaine while she was still only 17 years old. Addiction became another layer of instability inside an already dangerous environment. Eventually, she dropped out of high school entirely while the partying and chaos intensified around them. But even during the addiction, control remained central to the relationship. She had to beg him for permission to work because he did not want her around other people without him present. Later, when she eventually did get a factory job, she became the primary financial provider in the household, while he worked inconsistently doing seasonal or cash jobs. Despite her supporting the household financially, he still controlled the money and made all major decisions. That contradiction is common in coercive relationships. Control is not always about contribution or logic. It is about power. Bonnie also describes slowly reconnecting with her mother during this period, but even that became difficult because he closely monitored where she went, who she saw, and how long she was gone. Every interaction outside the relationship became another opportunity for accusations and conflict. One story she shares captures how exhausting that control became psychologically. She convinced him to let her meet an old friend from school at the mall. They spent time walking around and talking about old memories. But when Bonnie returned home, she was immediately interrogated about where she had been, who she talked to, whether she was lying, and whether she had secretly met another man. Eventually, these accusations often ended in physical violence. After enough situations like this, Bonnie says she stopped leaving the house, as much because trying to prove her innocence became emotionally exhausting. That is another reality many survivors describe. Isolation sometimes happens through direct control, but sometimes it also happens because conflict itself becomes so psychologically draining that withdrawing feels easier than enduring another fight. And over time, that kind of control starts rewiring how someone exists emotionally. Survivors begin calculating every interaction, every response, every word, every facial expression, and every possible reaction in order to avoid triggering conflict. Daily life becomes less about living and more about emotional risk management. That level of hypervigilance is exhausting. It changes how people think, move, socialize, and even physically carry themselves. Many survivors become quieter over time, not because they naturally are quiet people, but because speaking freely no longer feels emotionally safe. As the years passed, the abuse became more strategic. Bonnie describes him intentionally hitting her in places where bruises would not easily show. He hit her in the ribs, chest, back, scalp, and under her hairline, while bragging that he knew how to avoid leaving visible marks. She describes living with painful swollen lumps on her head from repeated blows, and says there were times brushing her hair physically hurt because of the injuries and hair pulling. That level of calculated violence says something important psychologically. This was not simply uncontrolled anger, it was control mixed with intimidation, humiliation, and awareness. He understood exactly what he was doing and how to hide it from other people. One of the things that struck me most in this section was how gradually Bonnie stopped recognizing herself. Before the relationship, she loved doing her hair and makeup. It made her feel confident and feminine. But eventually, even those things became targets for accusations. If she put effort into her appearance, he accused her of trying to look attractive for someone else. So over time, she stopped trying. That kind of erosion matters psychologically, because abuse does not only injure people physically, it slowly alters how they see themselves. Confidence and personality disappear quietly. Self-expression starts feeling dangerous. Over time, survivors can become emotionally disconnected from the parts of themselves that once felt confident, expressive, social, creative, or hopeful. The loss happens gradually enough that many people do not fully recognize it until years later, when they look back and realize how much of their identity became shaped around survival. Bonnie also describes losing jobs because she would show up with bruises, black eyes, swollen lips, or visible injuries she could not explain away anymore. The shame became overwhelming. She did not want coworkers seeing what her life looked like behind closed doors. Shame is one of the strongest weapons abusive relationships create. Survivors often isolate themselves further because they feel embarrassed by what is happening to them, even though they are not responsible for the abuse itself. And I think many people underestimate how emotionally complicated shame becomes in situations like this. Survivors often feel ashamed not only of the abuse, but also of staying, hiding it, covering for the abuser, or feeling emotionally attached to someone hurting them. They begin judging themselves through the same distorted lens the abuser has spent years creating. At 18 and a half years old, Bonnie says she looked in the mirror one day and barely recognized herself anymore. She weighed around 85 pounds and felt like she was dying, emotionally and physically. That moment became a turning point for her regarding addiction. She flushed the cocaine down the toilet and stopped using it entirely. That decision mattered because even while trapped in the relationship, part of her still wanted to survive. And I think that detail is important. Survivors are often portrayed only through helplessness, but many are fighting constantly in whatever ways they can. Even while trapped inside environments they cannot yet fully escape. There is a tendency for people outside abusive relationships to imagine survivors as passive, but many survivors are surviving through small acts of resistance every single day. Sometimes survival looks dramatic, but sometimes it looks like quietly holding onto the parts of yourself you are trying not to lose completely. One of the most disturbing stories Bonnie shares from this period happened years later at a local bar. Before going out, he told her to look pretty, but once they arrived, he became increasingly drunk and humiliating toward her publicly. He commented about her body to strangers, mocked how thin she was, and even forced her to stand up and turn around so other men could look at her. What struck me about this part of her story was how much humiliation became intertwined with control. Public humiliation is often used by abusers to reinforce dominance and destroy self-worth at the same time. It reminds the victim they are not emotionally safe, even in front of other people. After enduring the humiliation for a while, Bonnie quietly told him she was leaving and planned to walk home. On the way home, she stopped briefly at another bar after noticing her mother inside. She sat down for a cigarette and a short conversation, believing there would not be a problem. Then he walked in. Bonnie describes how he acted normal initially, before quietly leaning over and accusing her of embarrassing him, lying to him, and secretly sneaking away to another bar behind his back. Then he bit her face hard enough to leave visible teeth marks in her cheek. That detail stayed with me, because abuse often becomes so psychologically unpredictable that survivors stop knowing what might trigger violence at any given moment. Something as simple as talking to a parent for 15 minutes could suddenly become dangerous. Outside the bar, the violence escalated further. He shoved her, screamed at her, hit her, and eventually kicked her repeatedly in the ribs after knocking her to the ground. People from the bar came outside trying to intervene, while her mother begged Bonnie to stay with her instead of leaving with him. But Bonnie already understood something many outsiders do not. Sometimes the danger becomes worse afterward if the victim resists publicly. So she left with him. That detail says a lot about the level of fear already controlling her decisions at that point. I also think this section reveals how complicated public perception can become in abusive relationships. Many abusers maintain completely different personalities around other people. They can appear charming, social, funny, or caring publicly while behaving very differently privately. That duality often leaves survivors feeling even more isolated, because they know other people are seeing a version of the abuser that feels completely disconnected from the reality happening behind closed doors. Later that same night, After returning to the place they were temporarily staying, the violence escalated again behind closed doors. Bonnie describes him beating her further before throwing her out of the house around 1 a.m. while it was raining outside. She begged to stay because she had nowhere safe to go, but he threatened to hurt her more if she did not leave immediately. Eventually, she walked to her mother's house, bleeding, crying, and physically injured. Her mother was still out at the bar, but a friend watching Bonnie's younger brothers led her inside after seeing the condition she was in. Bonnie describes lying there unable to sleep, physically hurting and emotionally drained, while wondering what her life had become. The next morning, she saw herself fully in the mirror for the first time. Her eye was swollen shut. Her face was bruised. There was dried blood on her nose and lip, and the outline of his bite marks remained visible on her cheek. For the first time, there was no hiding what happened. And yet, even then, she still went back. That is one of the hardest realities for outsiders to understand. People often imagine there must be a final moment where survivors simply wake up and leave forever. But abuse creates emotional, psychological, financial, and survival-based entanglements that are rarely that simple. Shortly afterward, he began calling repeatedly and threatening to kill her cats if she did not return immediately. Bonnie believed him because he had already killed 2 kittens years earlier. So she went back again. That detail about the cats reveals something else important about abusive dynamics. Abusers often threaten or harm things survivors love because fear becomes more powerful when emotional attachment is involved. The violence stops being only about physical harm to the victim. It becomes psychological domination over everything emotionally important in their life. And by this point, Bonnie's entire world had already become emotionally controlled by fear, unpredictability, and survival. As the years continued, Bonnie describes her daily life becoming increasingly controlled and emotionally restrictive. He constantly monitored where she went, questioned who she spoke to, checked receipts, criticized her appearance, and expected immediate answers whenever he called. Even ordinary interactions could trigger accusations or conflict. Over time, she became so anxious about his reactions that she eventually stopped making eye contact with other people altogether because she feared what accusations might follow afterward. That detail stayed with me because it shows how deeply emotional abuse changes behavior over time. Something as basic and human as eye contact had become emotionally dangerous to her nervous system. By that point, survival was no longer just about avoiding physical violence. It was about constantly managing someone else's instability before it had the chance to erupt. She also describes losing most friendships and becoming increasingly disconnected from family. By that point, isolation was nearly complete. And isolation matters because healthy outside relationships often help people reality check unhealthy environments. Once isolation becomes severe, the abuser's version of reality starts dominating almost everything emotionally around the victim. That is part of why emotional abuse can become so psychologically disorienting over time. One of the most difficult parts of this chapter is watching how completely Bonnie's world started shrinking around survival. Every part of her life gradually became monitored, controlled, or emotionally dangerous. Friends disappeared, family contact became limited, jobs became difficult to maintain. Even ordinary social interactions started carrying emotional consequences afterward. That level of control changes how someone moves through the world psychologically. I think many people underestimate how exhausting hypervigilance becomes over time. Survivors often spend years constantly monitoring tone shifts, moods, facial expressions, body language, and possible triggers, because unpredictability itself becomes dangerous. Their nervous system adapts around survival. Bonnie also describes something many survivors struggle explaining afterward. The abuse became normalized gradually. Not acceptable, not painless, but normalized. People can adapt to incredibly unhealthy situations when those situations become daily reality long enough. That adaptation is not weakness, It is survival psychology. Another thing that stood out to me was how much identity erosion appears throughout this chapter. Bonnie slowly stopped doing things that once made her feel like herself because nearly every form of self-expression became connected to conflict. Over time, she became emotionally smaller in order to survive more safely inside the relationship. That may be one of the cruelest parts of emotional abuse. The damage is not limited to physical fear or control. Over time, people can become emotionally disconnected from the parts of themselves that once felt confident, expressive, social, creative, or hopeful. And eventually, many survivors stop asking themselves who they are becoming because survival itself consumes all emotional energy. Their world narrows down to avoiding conflict, avoiding violence, and emotionally enduring one day at a time. Reading this section felt like watching someone disappear while still physically existing in the room. The violence itself was brutal, but honestly, the psychological control affected me even more. The accusations, the monitoring, the humiliation, the constant fear of triggering another explosion. That kind of emotional environment changes how a person thinks, reacts, and views themselves over time. I also kept thinking about how young Bonnie still was during so much of this. These were years where most people are discovering independence, relationships, identity, and adulthood. Instead, she was learning how to survive unpredictability, violence, addiction, fear, and isolation all at once. One thing that really stayed with me was how often she adapted herself to avoid conflict. She stopped leaving the house because accusations followed every outing. She stopped putting effort into her appearance because it triggered jealousy. She monitored her own behavior constantly, trying to prevent violence that was never actually within her control to stop. That adaptation happened slowly enough that many survivors do not even realize how much of themselves they have sacrificed until years later. And maybe the hardest part emotionally is recognizing how deeply gaslighting distorts reality over time. Bonnie genuinely began believing many of the problems were her fault because he conditioned her into viewing his violence as reactions she somehow caused. That is one of the most psychologically damaging parts of emotional abuse. Over time, repeated manipulation, blame, fear, and unpredictability slowly distort how survivors view themselves. Many begin questioning their judgment, minimizing their experiences, and accepting responsibility for situations they never actually caused. I also think there is something deeply painful about realizing how much of her young adulthood became consumed by survival instead of growth. Those years should have been filled with exploration, friendships, confidence, independence, and building a future. Instead, so much emotional energy went into enduring fear and trying to manage someone else's instability. That kind of prolonged survival changes people in ways that often last long after the relationship itself ends. Not everyone listening to this story has experienced domestic violence, but many people understand what it feels like to slowly lose emotional safety inside unhealthy environments. Over time, people adapt in ways they do not always recognize while it is happening. Some become quieter to avoid conflict, others become hyper-aware of moods, reactions, or emotional tension because unpredictability has taught them to constantly scan for danger. Many slowly stop expressing parts of themselves openly because criticism, humiliation, or arguments eventually follow whenever they do. Those behaviors are not personality flaws. They are survival responses that often develop in environments where emotional safety feels unpredictable for long enough. If parts of Bonnie's story resonate with you personally, I hope you understand that adapting to survive difficult environments is not something to be ashamed of. Many people judge themselves harshly afterward for how they coped while living through fear, manipulation, or control. But survival often looks messy while someone is living inside it, and healing usually begins long before someone fully escapes physically. Sometimes it begins the moment a person starts recognizing that what they experienced was never normal in the first place. By the end of this chapter, Bonnie's life had become almost entirely shaped around fear, control, unpredictability, and survival. The manipulation that began in Part 1 had evolved into full emotional domination, physical violence, and psychological isolation. But Part 3 introduces a different kind of trauma entirely. In the next chapter, Bonnie faces one of the most painful and emotionally complicated experiences of her life, after becoming pregnant while trapped inside an abusive relationship. What follows is a story shaped by fear, coercion, guilt, grief, and survival. This is Bonnie's story, and it is about to become even harder to hear. Just a reminder, the stories and conversations in this podcast are for informational and personal reflection only. Nothing shared here should be taken as medical, legal, or professional advice. Always speak with a qualified professional about your own personal situation. Thank you for listening to No One Is Normal. If today's message resonated with you, you can find the book No One Is Normal on Amazon and Kindle, and explore more resources at www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co. Remember, you weren't meant to be normal, you were meant to be you.